Okay, so section 3.4 is about the brain and spinal cords. We're talking about, different parts of the brain, how that connects, stuff like that. So first, we'll talk about the spinal cord. So the spinal cord basically is the part between your brain and the rest of your peripheral nervous system that kind of connects it with everything else. So I'm going to pull up this brain model a few times. Basically, right here we have the brain, and down here we have that kind of brain stem merging into the top of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord goes down all the way down your spine, like you can see in this image here, and basically different nerves shoot off from that all the way through your body. Basically is sending the signal to your heart to beat, sending the signal to your legs when you want to take a step, all of those things. So sensory nerves bring messages in, right? So if I'm hearing something, sensory neurons are bringing that sound sense into my brain for processing. And then motor nerves are going to take messages out of the brain and into your extremities so that you can move and stuff, right? So if I'm going to take a step, if I'm walking, if I'm moving my hands around, I'm sending signals to my arms telling them, go ahead, move around, circles like that. So the spinal cord also has its own system of reflexes. So basically, that process where if I touch something, that signal needs to go into my finger, it needs to go all the way up my arm, it needs to go into my spinal cord, go all the way up to the brain, talk about stuff in the brain, get processed, then the brain has to say, okay, well, let's do this next thing, and then it's got to go back down the spinal cord, out to my arm, into my fingers, and then I can move my hand away, right? So if I'm going to touch something hot, right, if I stick my hand on a hot pot, that would burn me, right? So if I have to wait the entire time that it takes, and it is very fast, but if I have to wait even just a second for that sense to go into my brain, get processed, come all the way back down for my hand to move away, I could cause some serious nerve damage there. So what happens instead is basically you cut out the brain part. So you don't have to communicate with the big guy upstairs. You just have that sense come in through your fingers, hits the spinal cord says, oop, and you hurry up and move your hand away. So it kind of cuts out a little bit of really crucial time there so that you can have those quick reflexive reactions. So the brain itself is composed of a bunch of different things, right? It's a really, really intricate thing, and it's just like this little pink ball of mush that exists inside of your skull, and it controls everything you've ever done and holds every memory that you have. So really interesting to just kind of have in this little pink blob, right? So there's lots and lots of neurons in here, and we'll talk about neurons in a different section. But basically you have these different lobes of the brain, and we'll talk about each of those in turn. The brain has different structures on it, right? So we have our little wormy, kind of pokey uppy bits. Those are called your gyri, right? So those are the parts that kind of protrude. And then there's these little fissures in between, these little ridges, and those little valleys are called the sulci. Within the kind of center part of the brain, you have this really long, deep fissure. It's called the longitudinal fissure, and it's one really, really deep sulcus. And that is basically separating the two hemispheres of the brain. So your brain is separated into two hemispheres, right? So you have this hemisphere and this one. And right here is where that longitudinal fissure is. And within the longitudinal fissure, we have what's called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is what kind of connects the right and left hemisphere and allows them to communicate. So that left hemisphere and right hemisphere, interestingly, have what's called lateralization. So lateralization is basically the left and right hemispheres do different things. The right hemisphere of your brain actually connects the left side of your body, and the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. So if you see something out of your right eye, it's being processed in your left occipital lobe. So that allows some specialization of function. Most things are mirrored. There are a few specific parts of the brain that are not mirrored, such as the part of our brain that allows us to produce speech. So, if you are looking at something with one part of your brain and you can't communicate to the other side, some pretty interesting things will happen with that. So this corpus callosum right here allows for communication. So if the part of my brain that processes speech is in my left hemisphere, and I'm seeing something in the right hemisphere out of my left eye, it's communicating across this corpus callosum. And it's allowing the left part of my brain that can speak to see what I'm seeing in the right hemisphere, right? But in some cases, this corpus callosum is actually surgically removed and that's used for treating like really severe cases of epilepsy. So people who have a seizure, right? So a seizure is going to involve lots and lots of activity all over the brain all at once. And if you imagine that, like the whole thing lights up like a Christmas tree. And basically, you're having so much usage and so much overusage that it can cause irreversible damage, right? So if you imagine, you're running, right? You're a jogger or you're a runner, and you run way too much in a short period. Or if you're going to the gym and you lift something that's too heavy for you, you can overwork that muscle and kind of break it, right? And it can be damaged beyond repair or need like severe surgery, but we can't really do that in the brain. So that damage beyond repair is something that we want to try to avoid with seizures that are spreading around the whole thing. So one thing that we can do for people who are having whole brain seizures is to remove the separation, or to remove the communication between the two. So basically what happens there is if a seizure happens in this left hemisphere, then it's there and it cannot cross this communication point to the right side. So while we are still having a full seizure in the left hemisphere, we're cutting that damage in half, which can really prolong the lifespan of the brain in someone who has that severe epilepsy. But because of the communication of the corpus callosum, we end up having these interesting situations with these split brain patients, right? So when it's removed surgically, we have what's called a split brain. And this video I'll post underneath here in the Moodle page so that you guys can see it. But basically, consider where parts of the brain are able to communicate versus not communicate. And you'll get to see that in that video. So watch that and then come back here and finish this one. So we have some major divisions of the brain. So the brain can be divided into the forebrain, the hindbrain, and the midbrain. So the forebrain is basically like all of this top squishy pink part, all of the stuff that you normally think of when you think of a brain. Then the midbrain is made up of these like internal structures in here. So kind of like all these middle parts. And then finally the hindbrain is like this bottom chunk of the brain. And those are going to be like our most ancient animalistic kind of usages. And then the forebrain, all of this soft squishy pink part and the cerebral cortex is all of that big brain human stuff, like language and speech and stuff like that. Whereas, your ability to walk is going to be down here in that hindbrain. So we're going to talk about each of these areas and some different structures within them. So first is the forebrain and the forebrain structures. So the cerebral cortex is this entire like surface of the brain, right? So all of that squishy pink stuff that you think of when you think of a brain. And that's going to be those higher level human things like consciousness, emotion, memory, stuff like that. And then there are some subcortical structures still within the brain. So you have, or within the forebrain. So you have things like your thalamus, which is like a sensory relay station. So the thalamus is where all of your sensory information goes. So it comes in from your fingertips, goes up the spinal cord to the thalamus, and then the thalamus says, all right, you go to this section, you go there. So, the thalamus is telling your touch sensation, okay, you go to the somatosensory cortex. Your hypothalamus is used for homeostasis. So the hypothalamus is what keeps your body kind of regular, right? So homeostasis is that balance or equilibrium within a biological system that we want to maintain, right? You don't want your temperature to be too high. So your brain has to tell your body when to sweat and when to not sweat. You don't want, your heart to be beating too fast or to be beating too slow. So if you're using a lot of oxygen with exercise, your brain has to tell your heart, okay, beat faster. So all of that's maintained with the hypothalamus. We have the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland connects to the entire endocrine system. And that's where you guys are going to have those hormones and things like that we saw in section 3.5. And then your limbic system is where you have kind of emotional processing, especially negative emotional processing. And we'll talk more about the limbic system at a later time. So within that forebrain, you have 4 different lobes. So you have the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, and the occipital. So your frontal lobe, right, is this front piece, right? So if you just put your hand at the front of your head, that's your frontal lobe, is directly under there. Okay, your occipital lobe is way at the back. So all occipital lobe is down at the back. And then you have your temporal. So if you put your fingers like where your temples are and like imagine poking straight in, that would be your temporal lobe. And then up at the top here, kind of above that temporal lobe, is your parietal lobes. So each of those is going to have a primary function. So your frontal lobe, again, up here in the front, is going to be related to reasoning, motor control, emotion. It includes your motor cortex. So that is what allows you to say, hey, I'm going to take a step here. I'm going to walk in this direction. and then you walk in that direction. You have your prefrontal cortex. So this is what allows you to do like long-term planning, emotional regulation, impulse control. So all of those things that we see develop kind of later into adulthood. So your prefrontal cortex is the last part of your brain, as far as we know, to fully develop. So that's what happens at around 25. It's not that you wake up on your 25th birthday and you have a prefrontal cortex where the day before you didn't. It grows slowly, right? You guys can probably regulate your emotions better now than you could when you were 8, even if you aren't quite 25. So it does grow slowly, but it doesn't finish development until you're about 25 years old. And then we have Broca's area, which is for language production. So this is the part that allows us to speak. It's located in that left hemisphere, and it's the part that you saw kind of come into play during that split brain video. So when we have damage to the frontal lobe, and a lot of the way that we learned how the parts of the brain work back before we could scan them and things, is just if someone had damage to it, what happened? So sometime in the 1800s, this man named Phineas Gage, who was working on the railroads, who was helping build the railroads, got a iron rod like through his frontal lobe, and it went behind one of his eyes, and he survived somehow without modern medicine to tell the tale. And what people noticed was who was typically, prior to the accident, a pretty reserved, soft-spoken, well-mannered man. After that incident, he was kind of like rude, brash, and basically seemed to have a lack of impulse control. So that kind of is how we learned that that part of the brain is probably related to impulse control. Whereas, today we have things like electrodes that can tell where there's activity in the brain. But back then we didn't have all of those things. So damage is one of the ways that we learned about these early kind of insights into the brain. So next we have our parietal lobe. Your parietal lobe is known for sensory, like somatosensation, so touch sensation. So it has the primary somatosensory cortex. Basically, anywhere that you have touch sensation happen in the body gets processed here in the parietal lobe. So your tongue, your feet, your fingertips, all of those things, if there's touch sensation on them, it is going to be processed in that parietal lobe. Then we have our temporal lobe. So that's, again, on the side near the temples. And if you think about your temples, they're right next to what? Your ears, right? So your temporal lobe is going to be used for audition or your sense of hearing. There's some other functions, but the big one here is the auditory cortex. So that's going to process auditory information, which is sound. And it also includes Wernicke's area, which is essential for speech comprehension. So we have Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area allows for speech production. Wernicke's area allows you to understand language, and that could be written language, spoken language, all of those things. So if someone has damage to Broca's area, they tend to have difficulty producing language. If someone has damage to Wernicke's area, they have difficulty understanding language. And then lastly, we have our occipital lobes. That's way in the back. And if you think of occipital, kind of sounds like optics, right? So that being like things that you can see, like how stuff looks. So your occipital lobe's primary function, or like biggest function, is the primary visual cortex. So that is where visual information is processed. So you see it with your eyes, goes back to your occipital lobe and is processed at the back of the skull, or at the back of the brain within the skull. Your thalamus, like I said, is that sensory relay station. So senses come into the brain, go to the thalamus, and then are sent to the primary somatosensory cortex, or your primary visual cortex, anything like that. That limbic system is going to contain some things involved in emotion and memory. So your amygdala processes emotions, especially negative emotions like fear. Your hippocampus is going to convert memory from short-term to long-term. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. And your hypothalamus, again, is that homeostasis, right? So we're regulating temperature, body pressure. If we're hungry, it tells our brain to tell our body to go find food. All of that stuff is happening in that hypothalamus. And we have a couple of midbrain structures. So we have the reticular formation, which is going to be related to kind of like sleep versus awake. So it regulates that sleep-wake, maintains how alert and aware and aroused we are, and also regulates the motor activity. Then we have the substantia nigra and ventral tegmental area. So those are places that are known for producing dopamine. And dopamine within that substantia nigra kind of helps with some motor movement, which is why we can see affected motor skills in Parkinson's disease. And then your dopaminergic circuits also regulate things like mood, reward, addiction, So that's why, things that are addictive in nature are both rewarding as well as increasing dopamine, which helps you remember. So they can become more and more kind of compulsory in their use. And then finally, we have a few hindbrain structures. So the medulla controls your autonomic nervous system. So things like breathing, blood pressure, heart rate, right? You don't have to sit there and tell your body to beat your heart. It just does. And then the pons is the bridge, right? So that is going to connect the brain and spinal cord. So it's just this little part between your brain and your spinal cord, and it also has some regulatory functions during sleep. And then your cerebellum is this kind of like big structure down at the back. And that's for things like movement, coordination, balance. So your ability to kind of like walk around upright on two legs is controlled by balance and motor and movement in the cerebellum, as well as some memory processes, as we'll learn about in a few weeks. And then those few parts together are what we talk about when we're talking about the brain stem. And then how do we know what the brain looks like? We have some brain imaging techniques. We're going to talk about a few of these. So there's some radiation-based ones, some magnetic fields, and then one that we'll talk about involving electrical activity. So your CT scan or computerized tomography involves x-rays basically being passed through various parts of the brain at different densities. And they can be used to show like brain tumors, right? So here we have in A, a pretty healthy brain, but then in B, we have some tumors that are visible there. Then we have the positron emission tomography or a PET scan. So in a PET scan, this creates like a living image of the brain where we can kind of like view where activity is happening. And the way that you do that is by drinking a radioactive tracer. So you drink a radioactive substance, and that basically goes into your bloodstream and creates radioactivity within all of your blood. And then we can monitor that radiation outside of the head and see where the activity is in the brain. So it does show activity in different parts of the brain, but it is kind of an older scan and not one that we use very regularly. For one, radiation is bad for you, and pumping it directly into your bloodstream is maybe like not an ideal situation, right? Then it also doesn't have a lot of detail, and it doesn't show like a timeline of that activity. It just shows you like where the activity is happening. So what we have instead is mostly like MRIs and fMRIs now. So an MRI or a magnetic resonance image is going to use magnets to form a picture of the brain. Now, I'm not going to sit here and explain how magnets work, but just know that it uses magnetic fields to create this image of the tissue in the brain. And then an fMRI is a functional magnetic resonance image, and that basically just shows your metabolic activity over time. So it's like a timeline of brain activity, and that's kind of why it's used over that PET scan now. It also allows for a higher level of detail, right? As we can see in this PET scan image, it's just like kind of colors of where the radiation's happening, whereas in the MRI scan, we can see like actual like kind of sulci and gyri and different structures within that brain. And then our last brain scanning technique is electroencephalography, or an EEG. And that's basically where you wear this little hat and it's dotted with electrodes, right? And basically, if there's electrical activity in the brain, because all of your activity in your brain is just electricity and chemicals, so where you're having those electrical pulses, these electrodes can pick them up. So basically, if there's a lot of electrode kind of signaling over on this side, right, there's a lot of electricity happening because you're using this part of your brain, those electrodes are going to pick that up, right? And then if I'm like thinking about something, if I'm using like my impulse control, I'm going to have a lot more activity up here, electrical activity, and the electrodes there will pick that up, and the electrodes back here where I'm seeing stuff will be kind of silent, right? So that can track brain waves over time. So just a pretty brief overview of the brain imaging techniques. We don't need to know them in super a lot of detail, but that is like what we need for that. So that is the brain, and we will pick back up with any other information in the next one.